After giving my house away to my son, I received an invitation to sleep in the pantry. "It's the only space we have for you, Mom." They had no idea about the clause I included in the deed. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end. And comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." The day I handed over my house to my son was the day I became invisible in my own life. I never thought it would come to this. At 72, with arthritis gnawing at my joints and after suffering a minor stroke last spring, I decided it was time to pass on my beautiful Victorian home to Mark and his wife Diane. The house had been my sanctuary for 43 years, where I'd raised my only child, mourned my husband's passing 15 years ago, and cultivated my modest reputation as a watercolor artist. "You'll always have a place here, Mom," Mark had promised, his eyes earnest as we sat in Mr. Peterson's office signing the papers. "We'll take care of everything." Diane had nodded beside him, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "It'll be wonderful, having you with us, Naomi." I should have seen the warning signs then. The way she squeezed Mark's hand a little too tightly, the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. But I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing. What they didn't know was that I'd consulted Jonathan Wells, my old friend and attorney, before making this decision. "Naomi," he'd said, leaning across his desk, "let me add a special clause to protect you." I'd agreed without giving it much thought, relieved to have some security, but never imagining I'd need it. 2 weeks after the transfer, Mark and Diane helped me move from the master bedroom, my bedroom, to what they called my new space. I followed them down the hallway, past the guest rooms where my grandchildren sometimes stayed, down the back stairs, and into what had once been our pantry. "We've fixed it up for you," Diane said, gesturing to the small space with walls freshly painted a sterile white. A twin bed was pushed against one wall, a small dresser against another. My easel was wedged into a corner, my paint stacked in boxes beneath it. "The guest rooms are being converted for the kids," Mark explained, not meeting my eyes. "They need their own space when they visit." I stood in the doorway, my heart sinking as I took in the windowless room. The air smelled faintly of onions and cleaning products. "There's no window," I whispered. "We installed a good ventilation system," Mark said quickly, "and there's plenty of light." He flicked on the overhead fixture, a harsh fluorescent bulb that made the room feel even more like a cell. Diane checked her watch. "We should get going if we're going to make our dinner reservation. The moving men will bring your boxes down. Here." They left me standing there, surrounded by the bare essentials of my life, condensed and compressed into a space smaller than my previous bathroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hand over the thin comforter. Not the handmade quilt my mother had left me, which had always covered my bed upstairs. That night, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house from this new vantage point. The hum of the refrigerator just outside my door, the creaking pipes overhead, the muffled laughter of Mark and Diane upstairs in what had been my bedroom. Over the next few days, I tried to adjust. I arranged my few belongings as best I could, set up my easel and attempted to paint, but the fluorescent lighting distorted the colors. When I asked about bringing down one of my lamps from the attic, Diane said they'd been donated. "We had to declutter, Naomi," she explained, her tone suggesting I should be grateful. "This house has so much potential, but it was stuck in the past." At meals, I noticed they'd replaced my handcrafted pottery dishes with sleek modern plates. My collection of vintage teacups, gathered over decades of flea market visits with my late husband, had disappeared. When I asked about them, Mark looked uncomfortable. "Diane thought they were taking up too much space," he mumbled. "We packed them away." But I never saw those boxes. One afternoon, I overheard Diane on the phone as I approached the kitchen. "It's challenging having her here," she was saying, her voice low but clear. "She's like a ghost haunting the place, wanting everything to stay the same. Mark doesn't see it, but she's preventing us from making this house our own." I froze. My hand. On the doorframe. No, we can't put her in a home yet. The optics would be terrible. We just got the house. A pause. The pantry works for now. It keeps her out of the way. I backed away silently, my chest tight with hurt and betrayal. That night, for the first time since moving into the pantry, I cried. Quiet, muffled sobs into a pillow that wasn't even mine anymore. In the morning, I put on my brave face and joined them for breakfast. Mark was already gone, and Diane barely looked up from her phone as I entered. "There's toast if you want it," she said absently. I made myself a cup of tea in silence, wondering when my son's home had become a place where I was merely tolerated. As I stirred honey into my cup, I remembered Jonathan's words about the clause in the deed, a protection I'd never thought I'd need. Now, I wasn't so sure. Days turned into weeks, and I watched as my presence was methodically erased from the house I had loved for over 4 decades. Each morning brought a new small heartbreak, another piece of me quietly removed and replaced. My watercolor paintings, modest works that had once lined the hallway, disappeared overnight, replaced with generic prints of beaches and cityscapes that Diane had ordered online. The antique grandfather clock that had marked the hours of my marriage, my motherhood, my widowhood, was suddenly gone from the entryway. "We sold it," Mark informed me over breakfast, avoiding my eyes. It didn't fit with the new aesthetic. "The new aesthetic," I repeated softly. I wanted to ask when my home, my history, had become merely an aesthetic to be discarded, but I swallowed the words with my tasteless oatmeal. My garden suffered the same fate. The roses I had nurtured for 20 years, the hydrangeas that bloomed, in brilliant blues each summer, the herb garden I had tended daily, all ripped out and replaced with what Diane called low-maintenance landscaping. Gravel paths and spiky ornamental grasses now stood where my flowers had once danced in the breeze. "It's more modern," Diane explained when she caught me staring out the window at the transformation. "And honestly, Naomi, you weren't able to maintain it properly anymore. It was becoming an eyesore." I nodded silently, another piece of my heart breaking. The garden had been my solace after Robert died, each bloom a reminder that beauty continued even after loss. Now it was gone, deemed unnecessary, inconvenient, like me. The day I found my Boston fern, a plant I'd kept alive for 15 years, in the garbage bin behind the house, something shifted inside me. I retrieved it, its fronds bent and damaged, but still alive, and brought it back to my pantry room. Under the harsh fluorescent light, I promised it we would both survive this. But surviving became increasingly difficult as my isolation grew. I often heard Diane's friends visiting, their laughter floating down from the living room I was no longer invited to use. During these gatherings, Diane would casually mention that I should stay in my room to rest. "Mom's not feeling well today," she would say loudly enough for me to hear through the thin wall. "The doctor says we need to keep her quiet." There was no doctor. There was no illness, except perhaps the slow sickness of being erased from my own life. One Thursday afternoon, I overheard Diane talking to her friend Melissa in the kitchen, just outside my door. "It's such a burden," Diane sighed dramatically. "Mark doesn't see it, but having her here is like having another child to take care of. A very demanding, very outdated child." Melissa made sympathetic noises. "Can't you put her in a home? There are nice places now." "Not yet," Diane replied, her voice dropping. "It wouldn't look right so soon after getting the house. People would talk." "How long do you have to wait?" Melissa asked. "A year should be enough. We'll say her health declined suddenly." I sat frozen, on my bed, the fern trembling slightly in my hands. A year. They were giving me a year before disposing of me completely. Even my grandchildren, once so affectionate, now kept their distance. 10-year-old Emma and 8-year-old Jacob used to run into my arms when they visited. Now they hovered awkwardly in my doorway, clearly under instructions not to bother Grandma. "Grandma needs her rest," Diane would say, steering them away. You can say hello, but then let her be. One Saturday, Jacob slipped into my room while his parents were occupied upstairs. "Grandma," he whispered, "why do you live in the pantry now? Dad said it's because you're old, but Mrs. Henderson is older than you and she lives in a real room, out of the mouths of babes." I hugged him tightly, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that are hard to understand," I told him. "But I'm okay." He looked doubtful. "Mom says we shouldn't come in here because it's depressing." Before I could respond, Diane appeared in the doorway, her face tight with irritation. "Jacob, what did I tell you about disturbing Grandma?" She pulled him away, giving me a cold smile. "Sorry, Naomi. You know how kids are. No boundaries." After they left, I sat on my bed, my hands trembling slightly. Was I depressing? Had I become something to be ashamed of, hidden away like a shameful secret? That night, I heard Mark and Diane arguing upstairs, their voices carrying through the vents. "I don't understand why she can't join us for dinner anymore," Mark was saying. "She's my mother, Diane." The doctor said, "What doctor? She hasn't seen a doctor in months." Fine. But she criticizes everything, Mark. The way I cook, the changes to the house. Nothing is ever good enough. I can't take her constant judgment. I had never criticized Diane's cooking. I had never criticized anything. I had become so careful, so afraid of being even more unwelcome, that I barely spoke at all these days. "She's just old-fashioned," Mark said, his voice softening, weakening. "She'll adjust. It's been months, and she still looks at me like I've stolen something from her." "Haven't you?" I thought. "Haven't you stolen my home, my dignity, my relationship with my son and grandchildren?" Their voices faded as they moved to another room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I pulled out the small photo album I'd managed to keep, one of the few possessions that hadn't mysteriously disappeared, and traced my finger over a picture of Mark as a boy, gap-toothed and smiling, his arm around my waist as we stood in front of this very house on the day we moved in. Where had that boy gone? When had he become this man who couldn't, or wouldn't, see what was happening right before his eyes? As I tucked the album back into my drawer, my fingers brushed against a business card I'd almost forgotten. Jonathan Wells, attorney at law. I pulled it out, staring at the embossed letters and remembering the clause he'd insisted on including in the deed transfer, the one I never thought I'd need. Maybe it was time to call an old friend. I'd been avoiding the neighbors. Each time I saw someone I knew approaching on the sidewalk, I'd duck back inside or pretend to be busy with the wilting potted geranium that now constituted my entire garden. The shame of my situation, relegated to a pantry in my own home, kept me isolated. That changed on a crisp autumn morning when I ventured outside to collect the newspaper. Eleanor McPherson, my neighbor of 30 years, was pruning her rose bushes across the street. Before I could retreat, she called out, "Naomi, I haven't seen you in weeks." Eleanor was 80, 5 years older than me, with a spine as straight as a ruler and the sharp eyes of someone who misses nothing. She crossed the street with surprising speed, gardening shears still in hand. "You're thin," she declared, assessing me frankly. "And pale. Like you haven't seen the sun in months." I attempted a smile. "I've been. Adjusting to the new arrangement." Her eyes narrowed. "New arrangement? You mean being banished to that back room while Diane redecorates your house in that ridiculous modern style that looks like a furniture showroom?"
My mouth fell open. How did you? My mother visited last. Diane invited to show off the renovation. Eleanor snorted. Karen said she barely recognized the place. Said it was like you'd been here. The simple truth.
Words, like you'd been erased, broke something in me. Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. Eleanor didn't offer platitudes or awkward comfort. She simply took my arm. Come have tea with me. My arthritis isn't acting up today, and I made scones. That morning in Eleanor's sunny kitchen, surrounded by her collection of mismatched teacups, so similar to the ones Diane had disposed of, I found myself telling her everything. The pantry bedroom, the discarded possessions, the overheard conversations about putting me in a home. Eleanor listened without interruption, occasionally topping off my teacup. When I finished, she set down her cup with a decisive clink. "You know what this is, don't you?" she asked. I shook my head. "Elder abuse," she said bluntly. "Financial and emotional. And you're letting them do it." "Mark is my son," I whispered. "My only child. And that gives him the right to treat you like an inconvenient houseplant?" Eleanor's voice was gentle despite her harsh words. "Naomi, you were an art teacher for 30 years. You ran the Cultural Center's community programs. You organized the Historical Society. When did you become this doormat?" I stared into my tea, watching the ripples. "When did you become so direct, Eleanor?" She laughed. "When my Harold died 10 years ago. Suddenly I realized I didn't have time for nonsense. Anymore?" She reached across the table and grasped my hand. "And neither do you." That afternoon, Eleanor introduced me to her Thursday walking group. 5 women, all over 70, all widowed, all facing variations of the same societal invisibility that had swallowed me. There was Meredith, who'd discovered her son had been siphoning money from her accounts to pay for a vacation home. Patricia, whose daughter constantly threatened to take away her driver's license despite her perfect driving record. Helen, whose grandchildren only visited when they needed money for college expenses. "We call ourselves the Grey Rebellion," Patricia said with a wink as we strolled through the park. "Sounds more dignified than Angry Old Ladies Club." For the first time in months, I laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in my chest. These women understood. They didn't pity me. They recognized my situation because they'd lived through similar battles. "What did you do?" I asked Meredith, curious about how she'd handled her son's financial exploitation. "Changed my bank, changed my will, changed my locks," she replied matter-of-factly. "Then I took a cruise to Alaska with the money he thought I didn't know about." "I enrolled in law classes at the community college," Patricia added, "not to become a lawyer at 76, just to understand my rights. Knowledge is power, Naomi. Knowledge is power." The phrase echoed in my mind as we continued our walk, autumn leaves crunching beneath our sensible shoes. I thought about Jonathan's card in my drawer, about the clause he'd added to the deed transfer. I hadn't called him yet, still hesitant, to take such a definitive step against my own son. The next morning, as I returned from another walk with Eleanor, I noticed a truck parked in our driveway. Men were carrying out furniture. My furniture. The antique writing desk that had belonged to my grandmother. The armoire Robber had refinished as a 5th anniversary gift. I quickened my pace, heart pounding. Mark stood in the driveway, supervising. "The loading." "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice stronger than it had been in months. Mark started, clearly surprised to see me outside the house. "Oh, Mom, I thought you were resting." "What are they doing with my furniture?" I pressed. He shifted uncomfortably. "We're updating the guest room. These pieces don't fit the new design." "Those aren't just pieces," I said, watching as the men struggled with the armoire. "That's my history. Your father made that." Mark had the grace to look ashamed, but his voice hardened. "It's not practical anymore, Mom. We need to move forward." "Forward? By erasing the past?" I gestured to the truck. "Where is it all going?" "The consignment shop on Maple Street," he admitted. "They gave us a fair price, as if my memories could be valued by strangers who saw only old wood and outdated styles." Later that evening, I slipped out and walked to the consignment shop. There in the window sat my grandmother's writing desk, price tag dangling from the drawer pull. Through the glass, I could see the armoire against the back wall, Robert's careful craftsmanship reduced to a vintage find for someone's country-chic decorating scheme. As I stood there, the light fading around me, I pulled out my phone and Jonathan's card. It was time to understand exactly what that clause meant. It was time to reclaim my power. Jonathan Wells's office hadn't changed in the 15 years since I'd last visited. The same leather chairs, the same wall of law books, the same framed diplomas. Even Jonathan himself, though his hair had gone from salt and pepper to completely white, maintained the same thoughtful demeanor and patient smile. "Naomi," he said, rising to greet me. "It's been too long." I settled into the chair across from his desk, clutching my purse tightly. "I need to know about the clause, Jonathan. The one you added to the deed transfer." He nodded, pulling out a file. "I wondered when I'd be seeing you. Hoped I wouldn't, to be honest." "Things haven't gone as expected," I said. The understatement of the year. Jonathan's eyes softened with understanding. He extracted a document from the file and handed it to me. "Section 4, paragraph C," he directed. I scanned the legal jargon until I found the passage. "In the event that the grantor, Naomi Catherine Wright, is subject to neglect, mistreatment, or unsuitable living conditions while residing on the property, the grantor reserves the right to revoke the property transfer. Such revocation must be supported by documented evidence of said conditions and will result in full legal ownership reverting to the grantor." My hands trembled slightly as I looked up. "This is legally binding?" "Completely," Jonathan confirmed. "Mark signed it, though I doubt he read it thoroughly. Most people don't." He leaned forward. "Naomi, what's happening in that house?" I told him everything. The pantry bedroom, my discarded possessions, the isolation, the overheard plans. As I spoke, Jonathan took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When I described finding my furniture in the consignment shop, his pen paused. "They're selling your personal property without consent?" I nodded. "Items I never included in the house transfer." Jonathan's expression hardened. "That's theft, Naomi. Plain and simple." "They're my family," I said weakly, the excuse sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Family or not, they're breaking the law." He set down his pen. "If you want to invoke the clause, you'll need evidence. Photos, recordings, witnesses. Anything that documents the conditions and treatment." I left Jonathan's office with a plan and a small digital recorder tucked in my purse. The weight of it felt both terrifying and empowering. I was no longer just enduring. I was gathering evidence. I was fighting back. The next day, Saturday, I took photos of my pantry room when no one was home. The narrow bed, the lack of windows, the inadequate storage. I photographed the empty spaces where my paintings had hung, visited the consignment, shop again to document my furniture with price tags attached. Eleanor accompanied me, providing moral support and serving as a witness. "You should have done this months ago," she muttered as we left the shop. "I kept hoping Mark would see what was happening," I admitted. "That he'd stand up to Diane." Eleanor patted my arm. "Hope is wonderful, Naomi. Action is better." That evening, I heard Mark and Diane arguing upstairs, a more frequent occurrence lately. Their voices carried through the heating vent near my bed, and this time, instead of trying to block them out, I activated the recorder. "We can't afford this renovation. Not after the kitchen and the landscaping," Mark was saying, his voice strained. "The realtor said the bathroom needs to be updated if we want top dollar," Diane insisted. I froze. "Realtor?" "I still don't understand the rush," Mark said. "We just moved in." "This was never our forever home, Mark. You knew that. This neighborhood is too old, too stuffy. The house has served its purpose. It gave us a mortgage-free start and good equity. Once we sell, we can build exactly what we want." And my mother? What about her? A pause, then Diane's voice, colder now. We've discussed this. Golden Sunset. Acres has an excellent reputation. It's a nursing home, Diane. Assisted living facility, she corrected. And it's perfect for her stage of life. She can't live independently. That's why she's here, remember? She needs supervision. She gave us this house because we promised to take care of her, Mark protested, though his voice lacked conviction. And we will, by making sure she's in a place where professionals can attend to her needs. We're not equipped for this, Mark. I'm not a nurse and you work 60 hours a week. I pressed a hand to my mouth, stifling a gasp. They were planning to sell my home, and put me in a facility. The betrayal cut deep, but the confirmation of my suspicions also brought a strange clarity. This wasn't just about making me uncomfortable until I left on my own. This was a calculated plan. I continued recording as Diane laid out her timeline. List the house in spring, move in early summer. Have me settled in Golden Sunset Acres before their planned trip to Europe in August. We can use some of the proceeds to cover her care, Diane was saying. The rest goes toward our custom build. And if she refuses? Mark asked. She won't have a choice. Dr. Linden already thinks she needs more care than we can provide at home. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen Dr. Linden in over a year. When did she say that? Last week, when I spoke with her. You spoke with my mother's doctor without her there? Mark sounded surprised, perhaps even concerned. Someone had to, Diane replied smoothly. Naomi forgets things, gets confused. Dr. Linden agreed a cognitive assessment is in order. I turned off the recorder, my hands shaking with rage and fear. Diane was laying groundwork to have me declared incompetent. The steps were so clear now: isolate me, stress me, then claim my deteriorating mental state required professional intervention. The next morning, I checked my small savings account, the one Mark didn't know about, and discovered the balance was significantly lower than it should have been. I requested the recent transactions and found several withdrawals I hadn't made, all in the past 3 months. Someone had been taking my money. Someone who had access to my personal information, who could have found my bank card in my belongings, while helping me move. I called the bank immediately to report the fraud and change my access credentials. As I hung up, I noticed an email notification on my tablet. It was from the property tax office, confirming a change of mailing address for all future correspondence. I hadn't requested any change. With growing suspicion, I checked my email trash folder and found deleted messages from my credit card company, my insurance provider, and my pension fund, all confirming address changes I hadn't authorized. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about pushing me out or selling the house. They were systematically taking control of my finances, my medical decisions, my entire life. I sat on my narrow bed, clutching my tablet, the evidence of their betrayal glowing on the screen. Outside my door, I could hear Diane humming as she prepared lunch, sounding perfectly content with her perfectly calculated plans. I thought of Robert, of how fiercely he would have protected me from this. I thought of Mark as a little boy, looking up at me with trusting eyes, believing I could fix anything. But Robert was gone, and that little boy had grown into a man who was failing me in every way possible. No one was coming to save me. I would have to save myself. The evening of Diane's dinner party arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp air, clear skies, and leaves just beginning to turn gold and crimson on the maple trees lining our street. For 2 weeks, she had been planning this gathering, inviting Mark's colleagues and their spouses for what she called a sophisticated soiree to cement Mark's networking opportunities. I knew about the party only because I'd overheard her detailed instructions to the caterer while I pretended to nap in my room. By early afternoon, the house was filled with the aromas of expensive food, delivery men carrying cases of wine, and Diane's increasingly frantic directives to the staff she'd hired. For the evening, At 4 o'clock, she knocked on my door, a rare acknowledgement of my existence. "Naomi," she said, not bothering to step into my room, "we're having important guests tonight. Mark needs to make a good impression on the senior partners." I looked up from the book I was reading. "That sounds nice." "It would be best if you stayed in your room," she continued, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "We'll have the caterer bring you a plate." I nodded docilely, the image of a compliant, invisible mother-in-law. "Of course." Diane looked relieved, perhaps even surprised by my easy acquiescence. "Good, thank you." She started to close the door, then added, "We'll try not to disturb you." After she left, I sat motionless for several minutes, listening to her heels click back up the stairs. Then I carefully opened my dresser drawer and removed the outfit I'd been saving for just such an occasion. A simple but elegant navy dress I'd purchased on my outing with Eleanor last week, along with a pearl necklace Robert had given me on our 25th anniversary. I showered in the small half bath adjoining the kitchen, arranged my silver hair in a neat twist, and applied light makeup. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The defeated woman with downcast eyes had been replaced by someone with purpose, someone who refused to be erased. By 7, the house was filled with the murmur of conversation and the clink of glassware. I waited, timing my entrance carefully. Through my partially open door, I could hear Diane holding court, her voice pitched to Carrie. "The renovations have been extensive," she was saying. "The house had such potential, but it was so outdated. We've practically rebuilt it from the inside out." "It must have been a massive undertaking," a woman responded. "How long have you owned it?" "About 6 months," Mark answered. "It was my mother's house before." "Oh, and where is she now?" the woman asked. A brief pause. "She lives with us," Mark said, his voice suddenly uncomfortable. "How lovely," the woman continued, oblivious to the tension. "I wish my mother-in-law lived closer. The children miss her terribly." It was the perfect cue. I stepped out of my room and walked calmly into the living room, where 20 well-dressed guests were gathered with cocktails. The conversation stuttered to a halt as heads turned. "Good evening," I said pleasantly, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. Diane stood frozen by the fireplace, a glass of wine halfway to her lips. Mark blinked rapidly, his expression caught between shock and embarrassment. "Mom?" he managed. "Finally." "I thought you were resting." "I'm feeling quite well, thank you," I replied, moving further into the room. "I wouldn't miss the chance to meet your colleagues." A distinguished-looking man with silver hair stepped forward, hand extended. "You must be Mrs. Wright. I'm Richard Townsend, senior partner at the firm. Your home is absolutely beautiful." I shook his hand, smiling warmly. "Thank you, Mr. Townsend. This house has been in our family for quite some time. I raised Mark here." "Richard? Please." He gestured to the woman beside him. "My wife, Catherine." Catherine took my hand in both of hers. "It's so lovely to meet you. I was just saying how wonderful it must be for Mark and Diane to have you living with them." "It's been an adjustment," I said truthfully. "But family is family." Diane had recovered enough to approach, her smile brittle. "Naomi, I didn't realize you were joining us. Let me get you a drink." "Scotch? Neat, please," I said, naming the drink she knew I never touched. "And I'd love to hear more about how the renovations have been going. I haven't had much chance to see the changes from my room." Catherine's brow furrowed slightly. "Your room? Did you keep your master suite when Mark and Diane moved in?" Diane interjected quickly. "Mother's room is quite private. She prefers it that way." "Actually," I said, accepting a glass from a passing server, "I'm in what used to be the pantry. No windows, but the ventilation system is quite efficient." A ripple of awkward silence passed through the group. Richard cleared his throat while Catherine looked between me and Diane with barely concealed confusion. "The pantry?" she repeated. "But surely—" "It was a temporary arrangement," Diane cut in, her voice pitched higher than normal. While we renovated the guest rooms, 6 months is quite a long temporary period, I observed mildly, taking a small sip of the scotch and managing not to grimace at the burn, especially since the guest rooms were finished 3 months ago. Mark stepped forward, his expression pained. Mom, maybe we should show me the renovations? I finished for him. I'd love that, Mark. I haven't seen the upstairs in months. Before anyone could object, I was moving toward the staircase, trailing a wake of curious guests. Mark had no choice but to follow, along with several of his colleagues and their spouses. The master bedroom has been completely redone, I narrated as we ascended. It used to be quite traditional, handcrafted furniture, family quilts, paintings by local artists. Local artists? Asked a younger woman. How charming. Yes, I taught art at the community college for 30 years, I explained. My students often gifted me their work. We reached the landing, and I led the impromptu tour, down the hallway to what had once been my room. Diane had indeed transformed it into a sterile, hotel-like space with generic artwork and not a trace of the warm, personal touches that had once made it mine. It's very contemporary, Richard's wife offered diplomatically. I nodded. Quite. A change. I moved to the closet, my closet, and opened it before Mark could stop me. And so spacious, much larger than the converted pantry downstairs. The awkwardness was palpable now. Diane appeared at the top of the stairs, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Everyone, dinner is being served, she announced, her voice tight. Shall we? The guests filed back downstairs, murmuring among themselves. I caught fragments of their whispered conversations. Can't believe. The pantry, of all places. If my son ever treated me that way. As I passed Diane, she gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. What do you think you're doing? She hissed. I met her gaze calmly. Introducing myself to my son's colleagues, is that a problem? You're embarrassing, Mark, she whispered, furiously. And yourself. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. No, Diane, for the first time in months, I'm not embarrassed at all. Throughout dinner, I was the model of grace and charm. I shared stories of Mark's childhood that made his colleagues laugh. I complimented the food. I asked thoughtful questions about their work and families. In short, I was everything Diane had tried to present herself as, the perfect hostess in a perfect home. By the time dessert was served, the dynamic had shifted completely. The guests directed their conversations toward me, genuinely interested in my experiences and opinions. Mark's expression had transformed from mortification to something approaching shame. And Diane seethed silently at the head of the table, watching as her carefully orchestrated evening crumbled around her. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Catherine Townsend took my hands in hers. Naomi, it's been a pleasure. Richard and I would love to have you over for lunch sometime. I'd like that very much, I replied sincerely. After the door closed behind the last guest, the facade shattered. Diane whirled on me, her composure completely. Gone! How dare you? She spat. You've ruined everything. I stood my ground, no longer the meek, compliant woman I'd been pretending to be. What exactly have I ruined, Diane? Your image? Your plans to ship me off to Golden Sunset Acres while you sell my house? Her face went pale. What are you talking about? I know everything, I said quietly. The planned sale, the nursing home, the unauthorized access to my accounts, all of it. Mark stepped between us, his expression stricken. Mom, that's not— Don't lie to me, I cut him off. Not anymore. I have recordings, Mark, and bank statements, and witnesses. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, facing my son and the woman who had tried to erase me, I felt stronger than I had in years. Whatever happened next, I was no longer invisible. I was no longer powerless. I was Naomi Wright, and I was taking back my life. The days following the dinner party unfolded in a blur of confrontations and revelations. The morning after, Mark had attempted to smooth things over, approaching me with coffee and apologies tinged with excuses. "Mom, I know things haven't been ideal," he began, perching awkwardly on the edge of my narrow bed. "But we never meant to hurt you." I studied my son's face, the boy I had raised, the man who had failed me. "Intentions matter less than actions. Mark, and your actions have been clear." His eyes dropped to the floor. "Diane can be difficult, but she doesn't mean—" "Stop," I interrupted quietly. "I've listened to that excuse for months. I won't anymore." I reached under my pillow and pulled out the envelope containing the evidence I'd gathered. Photographs of my living conditions, bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, printouts of the emails confirming address changes I hadn't requested, and a transcript of their conversation about selling the house and placing me in Golden Sunset Acres. "This is what you've done," I said, placing the envelope in his hands. "Not what you meant to do, not what you hoped would happen, but what you actually did." Mark's hands trembled as he leafed through the documents. "Mom, I had no idea about some of this. The bank withdrawals, the mail forwarding. I never authorized—" "But you allowed it," I finished for him, "by looking the other way, by choosing the path of least resistance." He attempted one last defense. "We were trying to help you." "After your stroke?" "My minor stroke over a year ago, from which I fully recovered." I stood, straightening to my full height. "I'm not incompetent, Mark. I'm not a child. I'm not a burden to be managed. I'm your mother. And this was my home, long before it was yours." The confrontation with Diane came later that same day, after Mark had left for work. She stormed into my room without knocking, her face flushed with anger. "What did you say to him?" she demanded. "He left here looking like someone died." I remained seated on my bed, calm in the face of her fury. I showed him the truth. "What? Truth? That you're a manipulative old woman who can't accept change? Who can't let her son have his own life?" I smiled slightly, which only seemed to infuriate her more. "Is that what you tell yourself, Diane? That isolating me, disposing of my possessions, and planning to institutionalize me was for Mark's independence?" Her face hardened. "You have no proof of anything." "Actually, I do." I gestured to my tablet. "Would you like to hear the recording of your conversation about Golden Sunset Acres? Or perhaps see the bank records showing withdrawals from my personal account that coincide with your shopping sprees?" For a moment, Diane looked genuinely frightened. Then her expression shifted to something calculating. "It would be your word against mine. And let's be honest, Naomi. Who would believe a woman your age, especially one with a history of—" "Of what?" I challenged. "Medical issues," she finished smoothly. "Confusion, memory lapses. Dr. Linden has been very concerned." "Interesting, since—" "I haven't seen Dr. Linden in over a year," I countered. "Though I did speak with her yesterday. She was quite surprised to hear about all these consultations you claim to have had with her." Diane's confidence faltered visibly. "You're bluffing. Call her and find out." I stood, gathering my courage. "This ends today, Diane. I'm invoking the clause in the deed transfer. This house is legally mine again." Her laugh was sharp, disbelieving. "What clause? What are you talking about?" "The one my attorney insisted on including. The one that allows me to revoke the transfer in case of mistreatment or unsuitable living conditions." I met her gaze steadily. "The one Mark signed without reading carefully, because he trusted me, just as I once trusted him." The color drained from Diane's face. "You can't do that." "I already have." The paperwork was filed yesterday. 3 days later, I sat in Jonathan's office, signing the final documents that would officially return the house to my name. Mark had not contested the action. After seeing the evidence, he couldn't. Diane had threatened legal action, but her protests fell silent when Jonathan outlined exactly what would happen if she pursued that path: the public exposure, the potential criminal charges for financial exploitation. "So what happens now?" Jonathan asked as I set down the pen. I gazed out his office window at the autumn trees, their leaves a blaze of red and gold. "I start over." And that's exactly what I did. The first step was hiring a locksmith to change every lock in the house. The second was arranging for Mark and Diane to remove their belongings, supervised by Jonathan and Eleanor, while I stayed at Eleanor's house. I gave them 3 days, which was 3 days more than they had given me to adjust to the pantry. When I returned to my empty house, the silence was both eerie and liberating. Rooms that had once been filled with Robert's laughter, Mark's childhood games, and later, Diane's cold disdain, now held only possibility. I walked from room to room, trailing, my fingers along walls that were now painted in colors I hadn't chosen. The house felt both familiar and foreign, like meeting an old friend who has undergone dramatic surgery. I spent that first night back in the master bedroom, sleeping in a new bed I'd purchased, the first of many changes I would make to reclaim the space. In the morning light, I began making lists: furniture to buy, renovations to undo, colors to restore. But the most important decision came a week later, when Mark appeared on my doorstep alone, his face haggard with regret. "Mom," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to even begin apologizing." I studied my son, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the slump in his shoulders. "Where's Diane?" "Gone," he said simply. "After everything came out, after I really saw what had been happening, I couldn't stay with her." I nodded, unsurprised. "And now?" "Now I'm trying to figure out who I became," he admitted, "and how to find my way back to being someone you could be proud of." I didn't invite him in immediately. Some wounds take time to heal, and trust, once broken, isn't easily restored. "That's a journey you'll need to make on your own, Mark." Tears filled his eyes. "I know. I needed you to know I'm trying." I softened slightly. "I'm glad to hear that." As the weeks passed, my house transformed, not back to what it had been, but into something new. I rehung the few paintings I'd managed to save and commissioned new ones from former students. I rescued my grandmother's writing desk from the consignment shop, paying far more than it had been sold for, but considering it worth every penny. Eleanor and the Grey Rebellion became regular visitors, filling my dining room with laughter and stories every Thursday afternoon. I converted the sunroom into an art studio, finally pursuing the serious painting I'd always postponed. And slowly, cautiously, I began rebuilding a relationship with Mark, setting clear boundaries and expectations. Diane never returned. I heard, through community gossip, that she had moved to another state, telling anyone who would listen that I was a difficult, manipulative old woman. Perhaps in her version of reality, that was true. I no longer cared. One crisp December morning, as I sat in my studio working on a watercolor of the winter garden, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor stood on the porch, a mischievous smile on her face. "Get your coat," she announced. "I've found us a house." A house? A duplex, actually. Side-by-side units, shared garden, separate entrances. She handed me a real estate listing. Perfect. For 2 independent old broads who might occasionally appreciate having someone next door. I studied the photograph of a charming craftsman-style building with a sprawling garden and wide front porches. "It's beautiful," I admitted. "But I just got my house back." Eleanor shrugged. "And now you can sell it on your terms, for your benefit. Use the money to travel, to create art, to live your life without shadows." I looked around at the house I had fought so hard to reclaim. It was mine again, but it was also heavy with memories, both beautiful and painful. The idea of a fresh start, a place without history, was suddenly appealing. What would I do with all this space anyway? I mused. Exactly, Eleanor nodded approvingly. So, are you coming to see it or not? I reached for my coat. Let me get my purse. 3 months later, I signed the papers selling my family home to a young couple with 2 small children. As I handed them the keys, I felt nothing but relief and good wishes. May their memories in this place be kinder than my most recent ones. Had been. Mark helped with the move to my new home. A gesture of reconciliation I accepted with cautious optimism. Our relationship was different now, more balanced. He was learning to see me as a whole person, not just his mother, and I was learning to set boundaries I should have established long ago. On my first evening in the new house, Eleanor and I sat on our adjoining porches, glasses of wine in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of pink and gold. The gray rebellion would be arriving soon for a housewarming dinner. You know what I've been thinking? Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence. What's that? Home isn't always where you've been. Sometimes it's where you choose to go next. I raised my glass in a toast. To next chapters, then. To next chapters, she agreed. And to women who refuse to be filed away in pantries. I laughed, the sound free and genuine. At 72, I had lost a house and found a home. I had lost a son and found him again. Most importantly, I had lost myself and then, against all odds, discovered a stronger, braver version waiting to emerge. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the new garden in golden light. Tomorrow I would plant rose bushes along the fence, set up my easel in the east-facing window, and begin again, not as Mark's mother or Robert's widow, but simply as Naomi, a woman with a future still unfolding before her.